How's it going, everyone? Today we'll be doing chapter 6 of Tsotsi by Athol Fugard. When Tsotsi said city, he meant the open space formed by the junction of two streets near the gasworks. It was officially known as Terminal Place, but people referred to it variously as the shopping centre, because anything and everything could be bought in the small, dimly lit shops that were crowded along the sides, and from the hawkers' carts parked in the gutter, or the backyard, because of its relationship to the rest of the city, which was the white man's world. One wit had even referred to it as the quadrangle. The sophisticated spoke simply of the beginning or the end, depending on which way they were travelling, because it was here that the buses, with their bone-rattled multitudes, came together and parked on their endless traffic between the city and the townships. A few blocks away, if you walked with your back to the massive cooling towers of the gasworks, was the real city, the illuminated, glittering arcades of the white man's world. It might just as well have been on the other side of the earth. The life of Terminal Place, the shopping centre, the backyard, the beginning or the end of so much, this life started and stopped, faltered, or was furious for its own intimate reasons. It's early in the morning, so early that in the winter that hour is still part of the night. The first bus comes with its headlights on and its passengers blinking owlishly at the world through the cobwebs of sleep. These are the first workers, and in the cold, steaming morning, breathing their ghosts, they walk away into the city. Hands in their pockets, the collars of their jackets turned up, and their shoulders hunched almost above their heads. A few of them have stayed behind to buy a tin of hot coffee and vetkoek from the old woman on the corner. They stand around and drink gratefully and tear off chews of the doughy cake with their teeth. When they talk, it is softly, the words thick with sleep and spoken at the back of the throat. Before they are finished, the second wave of buses has pulled in and sent another tide of black men hurrying through the streets. By the time it was light, Terminal Place was alive. The shops are opened. The hawkers have trundled up their carts and unpacked their wares. The pavements are bustling with women fat with pride and progeny, with men thin with poverty and persistence, and youth full of tease and tit. They bump each other, they buy from each other, bargaining, bantering all the time. They come together and part. Friends are seen for the first time in many years, or for the last time in just as many years. Many no longer look hopefully for the missing brother or husband or father. And though it all, the buses still come and go. They travel urgently, jokingly, joltingly, tirelessly along the tentacled routes flung far and wide, tapering away from the compact body to the last stops in the dusty, rutted roads of the townships. The life of the place begins to decline in the late afternoon, the end starting when the windows, high and wide a few blocks away, burn gold with the last reflection of the setting sun. Night is near, and night is never safe. The fluid life of the pavement slows, and thickens like porridge left too long on the fire. Windows are boarded up, doors are locked, the bus queues sag like slack ropes between the lampposts. The people go home, when it is finally empty, much later, much darker, The street sweepers drift through the last of all, singing softly of the gentle rhythms of their brooms. It was into Terminal Place at 6:30, when the last of the day had turned those high windows into angry eyes, that Tsotsi and the other two rattled and roared on the 6:10 special from the township. He left 15 minutes later. He left it alone. He had lost the other two in the crowd, but he didn't care. He had found his victim, and he had a feeling for taking him alone. Morris Shabalala was his name, and he was also a man, but his stature, the extent of his manliness, was not in his body, because there was very little left of it since the accident, and what there was he dragged knee-high through the streets, using his arms like oars, nor was it in his hope, because there was even less of that. How, then, did he measure himself as a man? Because he used that word, throwing it back at the children when they smiled, even though they had done it so in pity. Screaming at once at a prostitute who laughed at his money and desperation. Ask him, and he will tell you. Bend down low where he sits on the fringe of the forest of legs rushing past on the pavement. Better still, squat there so that he can look at you straight in the eye. Don't smile, even in pity. Don't try to bribe him with a penny, because only then will he give you the measure of his manhood. I tell any man, I tell you. I tell, go to hell, mister. Go to hell and cook for your black sins. Whatever else you could say or see about him, Morris Shabalala was not afraid. That is why, when the foot came down on his hand on the pavement of Terminal Place, he had no hesitation in saying in anger, "Whelp of a yellow bitch." It wasn't because of the pain. His hands were hard now. His fingers had forgotten their disgust of the gobs of phlegm or dog piss, because they were no longer felt them. It was the insult of the foot that stung him. It meant he had been seen, and nothing provoked so easily to life the harsh and bitter truth about himself. No one found half a man as meaningless as Morris Shabalala himself. "Whelp of a yellow bitch!" he cried when the foot came down. "Can't you look where you go?" Usually they shook their heads and stepped aside. Some even commiserated, calling him Little Father. "Little Father," they said, "forgive me, but I did not see you," which only made matters worse. But this time it was different. The man said nothing, and he didn't move, not even to smile or scowl. He simply remained standing in front of the cripple on the pavement. Finding his way still blocked, Morris Shabalala threw back his head to swear again. But he didn't. He was moved to caution, something in the eyes looking down at him, as remote as mountain peaks, as cold, as sheer with threat, made him keep his peace. He satisfied himself with a grunt, swung his body to the left and carried on his way. It wasn't fear. Morris Shabalala admitted to having known fear only once, and anything that did not add up to the terror of that moment was something else. It was the day the mine shaft collapsed. Day? There was no sun down there, and by the same token, it was not night, because there was also no moon. It was altogether another world where time was a length of labour called a shift, and although the men changed, coming and going in helmeted gangs, the work never stopped, and the lights never went out, shining continuously on the damp, dripping sides of the shafts and the gleaming, sweat-wet bodies, so that it seemed that everything was compounded of the same elemental stuff. A man was no more than a chunk of the earth that had torn itself away to hack and hammer and blast unceasingly at the body of his mother. "We are moles," they sang. "We become rats. The owl is my brother. The sun is a stranger, and does not know me. The moon is a shy girl, and has hidden her face, and dissatisfied wife has left my bed." They heard it in silence, because the lights had gone out suddenly, and they had stopped singing and working, and were standing quite still. They knew it for what it was. Above ground, they spoke about it often, and those who knew said it sounded like a rumble in the belly of a bull elephant. "Got so," someone whispered. "It has happened." And then they had all run. Bedlam followed as they stumbled around in the dark, frantic and hysterical in their efforts to get away. If there had been light, Moore might have survived. He might have escaped unscathed, because when they eventually found him and lifted up the heavy beam that had fallen across his legs, he was only a few yards from the spot where he had been working. "Am I getting old?" he thought now. "Does half a man get older quicker than a full one? Am I getting old that a child's eyes can silence me?" "Tsotsi," he said aloud, and spat onto the pavement. "Tsotsi shit! Dog shit! Mangy! Dug dry! Yellow bitch shit!" Morris Shabalala was on his way to the eating house where he always had his supper. He moved slowly through the crowd. He moved slowly normally, but a lot of people made it worse. There were times when he had to wait minutes on end before sufficient room opened up for him to carry on. He moved by putting his hands down in front of him, the palms flat, and then dragging his body forward between his arms. This position limited his gaze to the small area of ground immediately beneath his head, and a little more on each side, because he could turn his head either way. If he wanted to look anywhere else, he had to stop and sit upright, with his stumps sticking out in front. He was glad when he turned out of Terminal Place and into the deserted street. The paving stones were still warm under his calloused palms. This side of the street had had the sun from noon until a few minutes ago, when it had disappeared behind the thick belt of smog that ringed the city. "Warm stones," he thought. "I can still feel you, and I like to feel you. Anything that was warm I like to feel, because once my legs went cold, and I learned that cold is the touch of death. Warm stones, how much longer will I feel you?" His hands were dying on me because of the too much work in dragging me through the streets. 6 years they have worked now. Yes, 6 years, and already there are parts as hard as the hooves of oxen, and these parts no longer feel. That first year, the summer of the first year, the first day of that summer, when I left the hospital only half a man, when my hands felt everything. Ow! They felt the stones and the hot tar and the burning metal lids of the drains, and that night when I picked up the grit and dirt out of the broken blisters and cuts. Then I cried and asked myself, was it not better that the coldness had gone beyond the hip, through my heart and into my head, so that they had buried the lot of me? But then I found the butter soothed my hands, and it was easier than the next day came and went, and now here I am, many days later, and my hands are hard, and only in some places do they still feel the warmth in these stones. I had a woman once, and when I fondled her breasts, I felt the warmth of life. He was halfway down the street when he stopped to rest. He examined his hands first, feeling one with the other, and the parts where his blackened nails made a hard, rasping sound on the calluses of too much work. Feeling nothing in either, the silence was sweet, melting like butter on his sore thoughts. There are no reminders of the past or mirrors of the present. He looked back the way he had come. A man was sitting on the doorstep of a shop a little way down, scratching disinterestedly on the pavement with a matchstick. Behind him, the chaos of the terminal place was sorting itself out. The crowds were already much thinner since he had left. There was enough room now for the greasy pages of newspaper that had held a sixpence worth of chips to waltz between the legs. Occasional gusts of the same wind came scurrying up the gutter. Small clouds of grey dust billowed up and then fell back, exhausted by the effort. Things like empty matchboxes or crumpled balls of paper moved suddenly and for no reason, skipping away across half of the street, to lie there, twitching furtively for a few seconds until another irrational impulse carried them off at a tangent to their first move. It was a warm wind. Morris Shabalala felt it, screwing up his face each time a flurry of dust swept into it. He wiped away the grit that had collected in the corner of his eyes, and then continued his journey. Once he started moving again, his face was even more exposed to the stinging clouds of dust, so he kept his eyes closed, opening them only occasionally to see that his path was clear. Why do I go on? He asked himself. I am not better than a dog, and slower. Why do I go on? It was a recurring question in his life. It had many forms, each of them sounding in their own way some new depth in the seas of disbelief and bitterness that swept him away from other men into his present loneliness. Is that all of me? He had asked himself in hospital. It seemed so little he could easily imagine his legs jumping around someplace else and calling themselves Morris Shabalala. Another time he had asked himself, what is there to live for now? The beam that had fallen on his legs had also come down like a guillotine on his life, severing him from all the purposes, the plans, the places he had known as a full man. They were gone, because that hadn't left of their own accord. He had left, turning his back on them the day he escaped without permission from the hospital. He still did it occasionally, when he saw a face he knew, or seemed to remember, turning away and hiding his until the person was past. Why does my heart not die for the shame of my life? When we chopped off the heads of fowls in my youth, the bodies ran around a little longer. It is like that with me, only it is my legs that are gone. When he stopped again, he was almost at the end of the street. He rested like a boatman, hunched over his oars. A few yards away, rappers were whirling past on the pavements of the main street. A lot had happened since his last rest. The wind seemed to have wandered off and got lost. The day was finished. Around him, the stones of the pavement, the street itself, the walls and the sky had merged in grey, ashen lines. Behind him, the street lamps, alight now, walked back to Terminal Place. It was at last deserted. From time to time, the dust and litter still rose and turned bal- ballet- balletically before falling back like the last survivors of an orgy. It had been a busy day. Much nearer Morris Shabalala, and sitting was as he had sat earlier on the doorstep of a shop, scratching disinterestedly on the pavement with a matchstick, was the same man. At first he did not pay him any attention. Then Morris realized that there was something strange about his being there. For a few more seconds it eluded him, and then he found it. The man, sitting on the doorstep of the shop, scratching disinterestedly on the pavement, was roughly the same distance from him now as he had been four blocks lower down. He examined him with a quickened interest. There was something else about him. He also found that after a few minutes, he was the one who had tramped on his hand in Terminal Place. They remained like that, the cripple and the young man, a long while, and in that time Morris Shabalala saw many things, like the slim arrogance of the body, the soft, idle hands, and the head that pretended not to look, but was doing so all the time. There was also a time for other thoughts, like why did he choose me, and Tsotsi shit, and has he been with me all day counting my money? Then he dragged himself as quickly as he could to the crowded and well-lit main street of the city. The money, he thought. The money! I was right to despise it, because he wants it, and if I am not careful, he will kill me for it. The money! But how else could I buy bread to eat and butter for my hands? Did I not try? Yes, you tried, Morris Shabalala. On that first day of the summer 6 years ago, you tried and said, "Mrs., please. Even if it is just the weeds in your garden." But you could see that they were not really looking at you. They pretended to be staring hard at something else on the ground, but not at you, and you knew already what it meant. When night came and you picked the dirt out of your blisters, you were still without work. Having nothing else to do, you counted the pennies and a few tickies that had come your way, and realized that there had been 5 shillings, starting with the old woman with the white hair and the fat dog, 5 shillings up to the last penny, and who had that been? You hadn't even looked up to see, but thrown it away like the others. The old woman with the white hair and the fat dog. "John, my poor boy." "Morris, madame." "Johnny, poor boy, what happened to your legs?" "Morris, madame. Morris Shabalala." "Does it hurt?" "Morris Shabalala, madame, is looking for work." "Stop it, Biggles." "Work, madame." "Biggles, stop it." "Come here." "Anything, madame." "Oh, these dogs." "Your garden, madame." "It is lovely. I'll weed it, madame." "Good heavens! There are no weeds in my garden." Then she had gone and come back with a penny which she gave him, afterwards closing the door, and Morris Shabalala, because he was looking for work, had thrown it away. Not many had given it to him like that, though, actually stooping down to drop the coin into his blistered palm. Most of them had simply fallen beside him out of the sky, falling hard and metallic, like the first drops of a sky that was promised the miracle of real relief, and then broken faith and blown away, and he, for his part, threw them all away because Morris Shabalala was looking for work. 5 shillings it had been, counted with deliberation and anger at the end of the day, because it helped to pass the time. The next day it had been 3 shillings and 5 pence. It was more or less the same for the days that followed, rising once sharply to just under 10 shillings, because that day he had cried, and there was no bush he could crawl into and hide his tears. The pennies had showered down. That was also the first day he kept the money, and it happened this way. He had stopped with his sorrow in tears on a street corner. His hands were too sore to carry him any further, his heart too heavy to drag down another street in his fruitful search for work. The determination he had had when he left the hospital to survive as best he could was gone, and also his hope, even his desire to survive. He had stopped on the corner, dragged himself into the doorway of an empty shop, out of the way of the hurrying feet, and for the first time he could remember in many years, there were tears in his eyes. So, not caring, he had just sat and let them come, and the pennies had come falling down. He had not even cared enough to throw them away, because he was too tired in his heart for even that. Hours later, many hours later, in the time between day and night, when the streets emptied and were silent and windy while the city waited for the movement to switch on its lights, then Morris Shabalala had looked down and considered the money. He was hungry and had spent the last of his money. He didn't have so much as a penny for a crust of bread. He had no work. He would get none, but he despised the money beside him. He despised it because of the way of giving and because he hadn't worked for it, and the people who got money they hadn't worked for were of a different breed from Morris Shabalala. 10 shillings it was, mostly in pennies, with a few tickies and 1 sixpence. To be exact, it was 9 shillings and 6 pence, because when he had sorted it out, being a neat man, there were 7 shilling lots of pennies, 2 lots of 4 tickies each, and 1 sixpence, all in a row before him. He realized he'd made a mistake in letting it accumulate. It was difficult to get rid of when there was so much. If he started throwing the pennies and tickies and sixpence into the street, it would attract attention even at that hour. They might think him mad, or take him away, or do something equally terrible. So what was he to do? Leave it, yes. Right. Just leave it and not look back. Fine. He would go somewhere. Where? Somewhere. But where? Not the eating house, because he didn't have any money for bread, let alone the butter for his hands. 9 shillings and 6 pence in pennies, tickies and 1 sixpence. It wasn't a long struggle. Maybe half an hour later, so short it had been, he started down the street, which was coming alive with lights and people, dragging himself and the extra weight of the despised money, despising himself for having taken it. Once lost, the battle was never fought again. The next day he was back at that corner, and the days after at others, some better, some worse, until he knew them all. The character of each, he learnt, was different, and their times, too. There was one which he sometimes worked late at night to catch the crowds from the bioscopes. The same one was useless during the day, while the one near the market was only good for an early hour. Together with this, there were other things he had to learn, like choosing one spot and sticking to it, no matter how bad it seemed to be. At first, he sometimes wore himself out trying one place after another, and ending up with sore hands and little money. When all this knowledge had been acquired, Morris Shabalala never went hungry again, and always had money for butter until his hands no longer needed it. So it went on his bread instead. But there was one part of him that starved until death, and that was his pride, until he filled his life and mind with the word man. He doubted it, and this doubt, working slow, taking its time in the years, the 6 of them, had bred bitterness inwardly. His cup was flowing over. I tell you, any man, I tell you. I tell, go to hell, mister. Go to hell and cook your black sins. But there was no man in his world to tell this to. Even when he threw his back head and shouted it up at them, they were too far to hear. They only smiled and sometimes called him Little Father, Little Baba, which was the word in his own language. Even the children, the youngest of them, those who had just discovered their legs, stood taller than Morris Shabalala. When he stopped again, he had negotiated 2 blocks of Main Street and had reached the corner where a lanky, mournful-voiced individual sold newspapers. Although they had never spoken to each other, a nodding relationship had been established between them. The newspaper seller had been at that corner almost every evening for as many years as Morris Shabalala had been crawling down the busy street to his supper at the Bantu eating house. Laid Desheen, he called. A few minutes ago, a van had offloaded bundles of the newspapers. City Desheen, Layit Sports Slits. He was doing good business, attracted like motherless souls to his cry. White people stepped out of the throng, bought their paper, and even as they scrutinized the headlines, were carried away again by the crowds shuffling past. For a few happy minutes, Morris Shabalala believed his fears to be unfounded. His pursuer wasn't to be seen. He strained his eyes in the effort to see through the milling, aimless mob, but he was gone, either lost or grown tired and turned back. Lay Desheen, the lanky one lamented, high over his head, in his own language, and even sadder tone he spoke to the cripple. They've shot a hole in the moon, strews gourd. I have read. A hole in the old moon, lay dee shin. He sold a few more papers. What is going to shine at night? He asked the world in general. During a pause in business of selling, he dropped to his knees and cut the strings around the bundle of newspapers. What else do they say? Morris asked him. Irish fancy by a length. At 7-2. She led all the way. He stood up. Lay Dishin. Sport results. They kept on buying. There seemed no end to the people who wanted to know about the moon and the Irish fancy at 7-2. Morris Shabalala looked at them without charity. His awareness of the man following him had been a dead drag to his already tired body. But finding him gone had lightened his heart only momentarily. His freedom from anxiety became a freedom to realize, with greater clarity than ever before, the extent of his infirmity and the gulf that had separated him from the rest of the unworried world. Had he been a man, he would have taken his sticks and beaten the little bastard to death. Instead, he had to crawl away, like a frightened dog, with his tail between his legs. He looked at the street and the big cars with their white passengers warm inside like wonderful presents, in bright boxes, and the carefree, ugly crowds of the pavement, seeing them all with baleful feelings. It is for your good that I have to dig. That is what destroyed me. You walking on stolen legs, all of you. Even in this there was no satisfaction. As if knowing his thoughts, they stretched their thin, unsightly lips into bigger smiles, while the crude sounds of their language and laughter seemed even louder. A few of them, after buying a newspaper, dropped pennies in front of him. He looked the other way when he pocketed them. He saw the man again, quite by accident. Someone had dropped him a penny, and he was pretending to be looking at something across the street while feeling around with his hand for the coin. The man was standing in the doorway of a shop, and he was watching the cripple now with frank and open interest. "You stool of a whore," Morris murmured. "You foul-smelling stool of a deceased whore." Morris Shabalala was a man, and now, only half the man he was, he is still enough for you. The night is long, and you will need patience, dog. He dropped down onto his hands and shuffled off. The lanky, sad-voiced one called out after him, "Your money, little father." Go to hell, Morris thought. Little father, your penny. He threw the coin in front of Morris, who let it roll away into the gutter. Here I am safe, he was thinking. Where there is light and people, I am safe. This world keeps its lights and people until late. He can still lose patience or meet friends. A policeman might stop him and ask for his pass. Please God, let a policeman stop him and ask for his pass. Now that he was on the other side, Morris was able to watch him without having to stop. For the first time in 6 years, the cripple did not notice the length of the street and the time it took him to reach the corner where he turned to the left. A lot of thoughts came to him, but many of them had no meaning. Are his hands soft? Would he ask himself? And then shake his head in anger and desperation at the futility of the question. But no sooner did he stop asking it than another would occur. Has he got a mother? This question was persistent. Hasn't he got a mother? Didn't she love him? Didn't she sing him songs? He was really asking, how do men come to be what they become? For all he knew, others might have asked the same question, but himself. There were times when he didn't feel human. He knew he didn't look it. The small side street that would have brought him out near the eating house was an unanticipated and major problem. It was deserted and badly lit. Its very shortness was its danger, because when people turned into it, they were out again in a few seconds. And then it remained empty for a long time. Even if he were to follow someone in, he would be sure to be left alone. He knew from experience that even the slowest walker was too fast for him. On top of this was his hunger and thirst. Without realizing it, he had been exerting himself, and now his armpits were clammy and had soaked right through his old coat. Drops of sweat shone like jewelry on his wrists and throat. Tsotsi was still on the opposite side of the street, watching his victim through the gaps in the traffic rushing past. Morris knew that if he was caught in that street alone, it would be the end. There was a solution, of course: to leave the money at the first lamppost where it could be seen. He despised himself for this thought, because as much as he despised himself a long time ago for taking the money. His salvation was announced by a blare of impatient hooters, and it came in the form of an old, decrepit car that had stalled a little way down the busy street. It was streaked with dust, strapped high with baggage and crowded, mostly with women, it seemed, because only 2 men had got out to push. They got as far as the corner, much slower in this than Morris Shabalala. and thereafter cursing and a lot of fist-shaking together with the laughing from the women, who were hiding their heads. They managed to turn into the side street. The other cars, the ones with the loud hooters, ground their gears with impatience and roared away, shouting at the car that had stalled and getting it back in good measure. The two men took off their coats and looked down the street. "Hell, Pete." "Ya, Stephanus. That's a thing, man. Just like that hay. Just like that man. So what do we do? Push, man, it's not far." But first they sat down on the back bumper for a cigarette. The one called Stephanus banged on the back window. "You laugh now," he said. "Okay, but wait and see." Whereupon the women burst out laughing again. The men rolled up their sleeves, their cigarettes dangling between their lips. "You know what I think it is? No. Distributor. Yes. Impatient buggers, hey? Strange place, this, Pete. Look at that poor cafe over there. Shame, hey? Ya, Stephanus. Okay, man, back to work. Ya." And so they pushed, swearing again, panting before long, pausing once, and all of this to the renewed giggles of the women, and in time to the slow rhythm of Morris Shabalala, who followed in their wake. The side street led into another wide thoroughfare, which ran diagonally away from the main street. In its way it was just as big and busy, but not as bright. Walking down it, you passed through a fringe world of unkempt, squarely ugly, mostly double-storied buildings whose doorways led off to the pavement into darker corridors and cement-grey backyards. At ground level there was a host of nondescript little businesses run by whites, Indians, and an occasional coloured, all of them existing like small parasites on the lumbering, unconcerned body of Africa. In the rooms above them could be found everything from cast-off white men lying on their beds and staring vacantly at the ceiling, to shyster lawyers and pass-book racketeers. In the side streets were factories and warehouses. A few of the big hostels for bachelor Africans were also in the neighbourhood. During the day the workers were here in their thousands, and at lunch hour they sat about on the pavements, talking sport or politics and playing draughts. When the whistles blew they went back to work until 5 o'clock, when the whistles blew again and they went home, pouring out like ants hurrying about the chaos of broken heap. In the Bantu eating house, Morris banged on the front of the counter and called up his order. Dish of soup, penny extra, which meant you got a piece of meat floating in it, and 6 breads with butter. The proprietor, Marcus de Souza, known to his customers as Sousa, carried the soup and bread to a chair in a corner which Morris used as his table. Sometimes he teased the cripple. "How is business? You make a lot today?" "Bloody stinking lot of white people. Here is your money and go back. You're rich, I know you. You're richer than me. Go back, I tell you. Leave a man to eat in peace." Tonight Sousa was tired, and Morris hardly noticed him when he paid for his food. It was a cheerless room, and reflected the poverty of a people who measured their essentials and excesses in the smallest unit of the white man's money. Everything sold in the shop was a multiple of the humble penny. The bread went at 2 pence a slice, the pudding cake at 3. Coffee was 4 pence a mug. The cold, oily hunks of fish sold at 5, meatballs at 6, and the soup at 7. These prices had been painted on the door of the Bantu eating house by Sam, the kitchen boy. He had left out the penny sign, beside each numeral. He didn't think it necessary. The room was furnished with long tables and flat wooden benches for seats. At one end was the counter. On it were 2 trays, the one holding the heavy black slabs of pudding cake, the other piled high with slices of bread. Usually there were 4 trays, but the fish and meatballs were sold out. The walls were sombre, dark green, and from the ceiling hung a few fly papers, crusted over with the dry bodies of their victims. Only the decorations in the room were a calendar advertising a lotion for straightening curly hair, and a notice in grammatically bad Shangaan. It had been painted in black in a piece of cardboard by the same untutored hand of the menu. It read, "This place knows no credit." Morris ate his food in silence. When it was finished, he ordered another 2 slices of bread. When that was finished, he crawled to the door and looked out into the street. He saw lots of people that looked like the Tsotsi who had followed him, but not one that seemed to be purposefully waiting or watching the eating house. He went back to his corner and ordered a mug of coffee. It was 9 o'clock, and he felt safe. The Bantu eating house closed at 10:30 on Saturday nights. 3 other men were at a table, talking in low voices. From time to time someone would come in, take something to eat or drink, and then leave again. Morris finally confessed to himself. You were frightened. He directed his thoughts at the rubbery reflection of his head in the mug of coffee. It was hot, and he blew on it before taking small sips. You were frightened. His reflection nodded up and down in agreement. You thought you had no fear, but tonight it was there, like a worm in your bowels, a small fear of death. When the next thought came, it was so great he put the mug down on the chair and rested his head against the wall, as if staring at the fly papers. He saw nothing. I want to live. I didn't know it. I want to be on the streets again tomorrow. I want to sit through another day on another corner. I want to be coming back here tomorrow night for supper. What's left of me still wants to live. Friend, the voice was saying, you didn't hear me. I was thinking, Morris said. Not now. I mean at the corner. It was the thin, sad-faced man. He put a penny down on the chair beside Morris's coffee. He sat down at a table, but in such a way that he could still see the cripple. You left it behind. I called you, but you didn't hear. I threw it, but you let it roll away into the gutter. He took a greedy mouthful of bread dipped in the soup. A penny buys a box of matches. 1 penny and you can set the world on fire. Newspaper headlines had given him a bent for the bold, dramatic touch. Morris picked up the coin and looked at it. The newspaper seller watched him, and when he swallowed what was in his mouth, he spoke again. People will kill for a penny. And then, as if replying to his own statement, there is nothing that somebody won't do. Morris put the penny away in a linen tobacco bag with his other money, and then told the man about the Tsotsi who had followed him. The thin one threw down the crust of his last slice of bread, lit a cigarette, and listened in silence. He had large, sorrowful eyes. The sockets were wrinkled underneath, as if by the weight of the eyeballs. They're dogs, he said, when Morris had finished. Mad dogs. They bite their own people. If I had my sticks, Morris said, and if I was a man, I would have killed him. The news vendor shook his head. It wouldn't help. The man dies in back street fight. 1 arrest. They'd hang you. It always happens. They always hang somebody. "So what does a man do?" Morris asked. The thin one stubbed out a cigarette and stood up. "Go home," he said. "Go home and pray to God on the way, and thank God when you get there and don't see nothing. There was a story once. It wasn't my business. Man denies responsibility. That's us." He said good night and left. Morris finished what was left of his coffee, then went to the door. The street was almost empty. He could see no sign of the Tsotsi. De Souza came behind him and looked over his head. He yawned and stretched. "Tomorrow," he grumbled. "Tomorrow and yesterday. Hell!" He blew his nose in a handkerchief. "It's finished. Today is finished. I'm closing." With a sharp twist of fear, Morris heard the door slam behind him and the bolts rattle home. He had been safe inside. Now he was in the street again. Still he could see no sign of the man, and like the thin one said you had to go home, there was nothing else to do, so he moved off. For some months now, home had been a derelict signalman's hut beside the railway line that some years ago had been used to carry goods to and from the factories in this area. It was no longer in use and would be torn up one fine day. Morris realized this, but wasn't over-worried. His first months in the city had taught him that there was a never-ending collection of places to sleep. He'd already had half a dozen homes. To reach his present home, he had to slip down another side street, and then along the loading bays of a factory. It was poorly lit. The lights were spaced at long intervals, and it was here that he realized that Tsotsi was behind him again. He heard the footsteps, and looking back saw him silhouetted in the light of one of the lamps. To reach the next light, Morris Shabalala had to crawl through a stretch of darkness. It seemed endless. He looked back repeatedly, expecting to hear the whisper of thick feet any minute. It took so long and took so much of him, not counting the blood from the cracks on his hands, that when he reached the light he smothered his tears and paused for breath, and then, finding the brightest spot, he took out his money and held it high for the other one to see before putting it down. It lay like a small but lustrous silver spot in the dust. At the light after that, he looked back to see what would happen, and what he saw was more terrifying than anything he had expected. The young man walked up to the heap of coins, looked down at them for a few seconds, then kicked them flying into the darkness, and came on after the cripple, who then started throwing stones. There were plenty lying around, and some of them were as big as a man's fist. Morris Shabalala had had powerful arms as a full man. 6 years of dragging himself through the street had doubled that strength. He threw hard and with accuracy, stealing a few feet between every throw. It was a good idea, because if he had hit the young man once, it would have been the end of him. As it was, all he succeeded in doing was to make him jump once or twice, and duck when they came hurling towards his head, rebounding harmlessly further down and skipping off into the darkness. Crawling forward after one such throw, Morris Shabalala looked back and could see him no more. He knew then that the young man was keeping to the shadows and darkness, and that the moment was near. If I can't see him, he can hear me. And it was with that thought that he started swearing. He filled the night with obscenities, roaring them between his tears, throwing the words with even more violence than the stones. He kept it up until his voice cracked, and was only a whisper. A few minutes later, a few more feet, and he was in the final darkness beyond the last light, and he knew that he had come to the moment and the place for which the young one had waited so patiently the whole night.